first was young Miss Ratton. She tried not to let him in. He stabbed her with a corn knife. That's how his crimes begin. The next was Grandma Ratton, so old and tired and gray. She fit off her attacker until his strength gave way. The next was Grandpa Ratton, a setting by the fire. He came up close behind him and strangled him with wire. The last was Baby Ratton, all in his trundle bed. He stove him in the short ribs until that child was dead. And then he spit tobacco juice on his golden head.
The Ratton Family Murders. The Ratton family home was a wooden cabin surrounded by trees near Glendale, Indiana. Living there was Denson Ratton, the sickly head of the family, his wife Ada, and their children Ethel, Stella, and Henry. Also living in the cabin was Denson's elderly mother, Elizabeth Ratton, a Civil War widow who still received a pension from her late husband's death. James Stone, known as Bud, lived nearby with his wife Cecilia, and he knew the Rattons well. Stone was a farmer aged 42, 5 feet and 9 inches tall, with prominent ears and a walrus mustache and a bulging, blood-filled lump on the left side of his neck. Like everyone else in the area, he heard rumors that Elizabeth Ratton had a considerable amount of money saved and kept it hidden somewhere in the cabin. It was said to be as much as $2,000, a sum worth close to $60,000 today. On Monday, September 18, 1893, the night of the murders, Cecilia woke up to find her husband no longer in bed, but out in their yard. Somewhere she heard him talking to someone. When he returned, she asked him who he was talking to. He said it was the dog. Stone told her that he was suffering from a toothache and was heading over to Glendale to get it pulled. He left about 10 p.m. that night, taking with him both his corn knife and a hatchet, which he hung around his suspenders, with the short end of the handle dangling against his leg. Reaching the Ratton's cabin, Stone peered in through the window and saw Ada giving her husband medicine as he lay in bed. Denson was very sick with typhoid fever and relied on his wife for everything. Stone could see the couple's 3 children in the same room, but no sign of the older lady. This description of what came next is taken from the Indianapolis Journal on February 16, 1894, which based its account on Stone's own confession and the evidence of the crime scene. Nerving himself for the awful work, Stone approached the back door and knocked. Young Miss Ratton, Ada, responded, and when she opened the door, he asked her if she had anything that would be good for a toothache. She said she had a painkiller and turned to get it. When she returned with the medicine, Stone struck her point blank in the face with a corn knife, and as the woman screamed, he rained down blows with the deadly weapon to her face and neck, which she then fell to the floor. Leaping over her body, he rushed to the room in which the sick man and his children lay. Ethel rose on her elbows and cried, "Bud Stone, what are you doing here?" Grasping the hatchet, he dealt her a blow on the forehead that crushed her skull. Turning to his neighbor, Denson, who had just opened his eyes, still drowsy from the medicine his wife had given him earlier, aroused in a weakened state at the unusual noise. Bud embedded the base of the hatchet into his skull. He then swung the hatchet and almost severed Ratton's head with several vicious blows. The baby was attacked next. Pulling it from its cradle, he struck it with one blow across the backside of its head, cleaving the skull. His bloody work well begun, he leaped at Stella, who had tried to escape, and she was soon laying on the floor in a pool of her own blood. He then tried the door leading to the room of the grandma. It was locked. Stone then rushed from the house, busted open the window of the grandmother, and he stepped through it. The grandmother tried to escape the room, but a terrible fight ensued in the dark. Stone attacked her, cutting off both hands at the wrist as she attempted to protect herself. She finally fell out of weakness and loss of blood, then Stone easily finished her off. Striking a light, Stone beheld the ghastly work he had done, and while he had intended searching for the money, he says his heart failed him and he retreated through the window. When again on the outside, he thought he might not have completed his work, that some of his victims might yet be living. He then re-entered the cabin and found Denson Ratton moving his head back and forth. Flying at him, a blow was dealt across the forehead, and a quiver told him his work was complete. Convinced everyone must now be dead, but still afraid to search for the money, Stone fled. Passing through the woods on his way home, he hid the bloody corn knife and the hatchet under a log and threw some leaves on top. He got home around 2 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. A few hours later, Cecilia was fixing breakfast when she saw her husband washing blood from his shirt at the farm spring. When she asked where the blood had come from, he claimed it was from his tooth that he had pulled the night before. Straight after breakfast, Stone announced he was going to take a walk over to the Ratton's cabin to see how Denton was faring from his illness. He took his young son with him, who was terrified at the sight that he saw. Stone's child realized that a murder had taken place and begged his father to leave. Stone did not leave until he was convinced that not one of the Rattons would be able to tell his story. He did not realize then that little Ethel was not dead. Stone took his son back home. Then he rode into Washington on horseback to report he'd found all 6 members of the Ratton family murdered at their cabin, with no clue to the killer's identity. The city was shocked as never before. The Indianapolis Journal tells us Sheriff Lemur telegraphed to Seymour for Carter's bloodhounds, and the dogs arrived the next morning. Meanwhile, thousands of people hurried to the scene of the tragedy. 2 of those people were Denton's cousins, Isabel Ratton and her daughter Sula May, who lived together just 5 miles from the murder scene. An interview of one of Isabel's descendants, Janet Potts, said, "My grandmother Sula May told me she used to play with the Ratton children. When they were murdered, her mom took her over to the house where the bodies were. People were touring the house and women were fainting at the sight. Apparently Stone hid the axe and the knife he used on my great-grandfather's property." If the visitors hoped for a gory scene, they weren't disappointed. The Indianapolis Journal went on to say, "At the back door lay the body of Ada Ratton, Denson Ratton's wife, mutilated in a horrible manner. In an adjoining room was the body of Mr. Ratton laying on the bed with his hands crossed over his chest and a depression in his forehead as if it was made with the handle of a hatchet. His body was rigid in death. His face was also horribly lacerated. Near a little cradle lay the body of the baby Henry, aged 3 years, and the head of the infant bearing a cut 6 inches in length. On a small couch in the same room lay Ethel Ratton, aged 11. On her forehead was a depression similar to the wound on her father's head. Examination showed the girl to be in a comatose condition. Between the couch and the father's bed, the mangled body of Stella Ratton, aged 9, lay. The most revolting scene was in the room that had been the apartment of Denson Ratton's mother, Miss Elizabeth Ratton. She was hacked almost beyond recognition. Both arms were cut off. The face was cut to shreds, and the breast horribly mutilated. Her body was soaked in blood, the carpet, bedding, curtains, and furniture spattered with gore. The Indianapolis Star adds that Elizabeth's room showed evidence of a titanic struggle between her and the man who killed her. The furniture was broken and upset, and bloody fingerprints were to be found in every section of the room. Stone later confirmed this, telling the police the old woman had fought like hell. Robert Swanigan and his wife, another of the local families took Ethel Ratton in, hoping she could be nursed back to health and reveal who massacred her family. Despite the best care they could provide, including drilling a hole in her skull to relieve the pressure of a brain bleed, she remained stubbornly unconscious. Stone assisted at the Ratton family funeral, acting as a pallbearer and weeping as the coffins were lowered into the ground. He also did the best he could to convince people he was joining enthusiastically in the search for their killers. When Carter's bloodhounds arrived in town, they led their handlers directly to Stone's door and, in the words of one paper, attacked him furiously. And yet somehow he still managed to escape suspicion. All that troubled him now was the matter of Ethel and the nagging fear in his mind that she might yet wake up and send him to the gallows. He knew Robert Swanigan and his family well enough to be welcome in their home and called there regularly, professing his concern for poor little Ethel's condition. 3 days after the murders, as signs appeared that she might be improving a little, he saw his chance. Stone called again at the Swanigans' house and offered to sit with Ethel alone for a while so they could eat their dinner in peace. This, of course, was not denied him. Bedford's Daily Mail reports, and when he was left alone, he placed his hands on the child's mouth and nostrils and smothered her. She had been so weak that nothing unusual was noted by those who returned to the room, and when the fact was discovered, the feeling was that the poor child had died of her wounds. After weeping at the bedside a few minutes, the murderer left the house unaccused and unsuspected, with 5 of his victims in the little churchyard a mile away, and the other growing icy with death. He felt his crime had been covered up. As he headed home from the Swanigans' place that September evening, Stone had every reason to think that he had gotten away with murder once again. Stone's luck had run out when his wife Cecilia told a friend about his trip to Glendale on the night of the murders and the blood she had seen on his shirt the next morning, saying she felt that he knew more about the killings than he let on. The friend passed this information on to the authorities, who pulled Stone in for questioning. He confessed immediately to taking part in the plan to rob the Rattons, but said he was only one member of the gang responsible. His version of the events was that he arrived a little late at the Rattons' cabin on the night they decided to rob it, and discovered the rest of the gang had already murdered everybody inside. "Damn you, Stone. You got here a little too late for the fun," he claimed another gang member had told him. "We had a picnic with all except the old woman, and she fought like hell." Pressed to identify the members of this supposed gang, Stone named 6 local men: Alonzo Williams, Gradison Cosby, William Kays, Martin Yarburg, Gip Clark, and John White, all of whom were promptly arrested. A lynch mob from Washington rode 16 miles to Glendale, hoping to hang these men without trial, but were frustrated when they discovered the police had already spirited them away to Jefferson's prison to ensure their safety. Stone later withdrew his attempt to implicate anyone else in the killings, giving police a new confession stating he carried out the murders alone. Tried for murder in October 1893, Stone entered a plea of guilty, but begged the court to be lenient with him. Judge William Gardner replied that he must hang and set the execution date for February 16th the following year. It would take place in Jefferson Prison in Michigan City, Indiana's state penitentiary. Reporters turned out in force to witness Stone's death, with one onlooker remarking that about 1 in 3 of the spectators seemed to be reporters. Also in the crowd were Sheriff Lemming, Warden James Patton, who ran the prison, a group of Patton's guards, and 10 people Stone himself invited. The first stories filed all focused on how unperturbed he seemed to be by his impending death. Stone's last night on Earth was passed in a deep sleep. The Indianapolis Journal confided, his appetite never failed him. Others described the gallows in detail, noting that the height of the drop was 6 feet and the rope's thickness was 3/4 of an inch. Almost before the spectators had settled themselves in position, Stone appeared on the trap. 2 guards quickly adjusted the strap around his legs and bound his arms tight to his body. Stone continued to gaze upwards. The muscles of his face twitched, but he gave no other sign of emotion except that his body was weaving back and forth slightly. The black cap was pulled over his face. Warden Patton then placed the loop of the noose over his head and adjusted it low on his neck. The trap was sprung at once, and before the spectators were expecting it. The body vibrated for a second, and the shoulders slightly convulsed. Then the form was motionless. The head inclined toward the left shoulder, the knot having been adjusted under the right ear on account of the enormous growth below the left jaw. Physicians quickly approached the body to count his pulse. Stone was pronounced dead of a broken neck at 12:21 a.m., some 13 minutes after the trap had been pulled, his body then being cut down and placed in an awaiting coffin. In an especially gruesome touch, guards found that the rope's pressure had burst the large swelling on Stone's neck, blood from which now soaked the black cap Patton had pulled over his face on the gallows. All that remained was finding somewhere to bury him, but even that turned out to be no simple matter. The Ratton's friends and neighbors objected strongly to seeing him buried in Davis County, saying they'd dig the body up and burn it if that happened. So strong was the feeling against Stone that the Washington undertaker, who'd normally have handled the burial, refused to take part in the job. In the end, it was decided that the remains must go to the Washington farm owned by Bud's father, Elias. When the locals shouted about making good on their threats to dig him up, Elias reminded them that the spot he had chosen was within easy rifle range of his front porch. That seemed to do the trick. The burial went on ahead without incident, and the site was left undisturbed. Something to add is, Stone continued to claim he'd never taken any money from the cabin, though not everyone believed him. Police handling the crime scene found a total of $625 still hidden in the seam of Elizabeth's dress, and some found under clothes in her drawer. Perhaps that was all that was left of her pension. All the other men that were accused were later released and accepted to be innocent. This raised the interesting question of who, if anyone, Stone's wife heard him talking to in the yard on the night of the murders. None of the reports seen can shed any light on this. Stone's body was taken from the gallows to an autopsy table, where the doctors removed his brain to study it. They found it to have no abnormalities, and that Stone was of average intelligence. Stone was buried next to one of his children, a young girl who had died while her father was awaiting execution.